Yes, colleagues. So as Jenny mentioned, this is part of the NRF, one of the big funds that we've received, funding mechanisms. And it's a 3-year project. And the idea behind these sessions, or this as particular part of the session, is to build capacity, to build skills, and not only to build skills, but to kind of reflect on skills that we might have. Just what I'm trying to show as well today is that many of these things we'll be speaking about, are things that we all do in one way or another, but we don't necessarily always think about it as such. And one of the benefits about being more aware and more reflective on these kinds of practices is you can become aware that you're actually doing it, but it's also to sharpen when you are doing it, when you have more reflection on the types of questions, you're thinking about more the potential value in thinking about these approaches and these methodologies. It can just be for the good. So this is part of the NRF, but it's also part of this particular project, which is, as all CriSHET work is, on the university, new ways of thinking about the university and university engagement. But the methodologies and the approaches and the ideas are, of course, transcending the particularities of this project and, in fact, any given project. So hopefully this will be of value, even if you're not directly working on the NRF project or even directly working on any of Prof's research work. If you do more other types of projects involved and other kinds of work as a chair, I hope this will be interesting to you beyond the particularities of this workshop and the NRF project. So, first and foremost, as Jenny said, critical speculative, a mouthful. And to be perfectly honest, that was mostly chosen as a kind of very intelligent, smart-sounding kind of etiquette to put on this whole project in terms of workshopping. But in many ways, it comes down to these 2 words, theory building, or otherwise just sum up in one word, theorization. Now, just to probe you all, could I ask anyone's opinion or their views or what the impression is when you hear the word theory building or theorization? What do you think of when you hear this word? Jenny, I don't know if there's a way we can see if there's any hands or anything coming up. I can't see from where I'm sitting.
I should be able to see hand, but I don't.
Be able to see.
Oh wait, Joe has a hand. Please, unmute. Go ahead, Joe.
I was testing the hand. All right.
Yeah.
But that's what it's. You volunteered as tribute now.
Yes, so you can't back out now, Joe.
Well, when I hear theorization, it sounds to me like an attempt to explain certain way that things happen to be. So when I hear theorization, it's more like a sort of explanation, usually out of patterns, out of reading of trends, to then explain how certain things are likely to turn out. Yeah.
Yes, thank you so much, Joe. Yes, so firstly, explaining the world, explaining patterns, explaining things. So there's a lot of almost observation and working with those observations. Michaela?
Because I see the words theory and building together,
Yes.
I think of something more like you have an understanding, but you're wanting to raise it or deepen it or, look at it from all sides.
Okay.
As opposed to, theorizing, which matches very nicely with what Joe did.
Yes. Thanks, Michaela. Yeah, so that's another important part. So the 2 kind of go together, although they don't always necessarily go together. But in an ideal world, most of the most influential thinkers and academic scholars are people who do a bit of both and marry them. So the first part, as Joe mentioned, much more the kind of observation. Joe, I also like the word you used, reading. You said reading for patterns. And that emphasis on reading is quite important. Even though quite often people don't think about theorization in relation to theory. So very often when you think theory, people also think thinking. Right? So you come up with a lot of grand ideas. Yes, that is part of it. But another very important part of it, and perhaps the most important of it, is the reading part. To be able to see certain things and then work with what you see. And then, as Michaela just mentioned, bringing that in with a deeper sense of trying to see from different perspectives of building of not only what is given, but trying to work with that and mold it and shape it. So those are two very important ideas. Any other last ideas or comments or impressions on theorization? Let me then ask, when you think about theorists, if I have to now put it into a noun, into a person, who comes to mind? Any from your own experience from the fields, and whether you're in sociology or history or literature or anthropology, can you name a number of theorists? Just off the top of your head.
I have a list of people I think of as theorists.
Okay.
Probably quite extensive, though.
Okay.
In terms of actually literature, like Terry Eagleton.
Yeah.
Then, in literature, we often use theory, which would generally be like from a range of other disciplines, like Freud or Lacan could be considered theorists in that sense. Most theorists like Edward Said, Judith Butler, like theorists. So those are some of the ones. And that comes from a range of like psychology or psychoanalytics, and then, post-structuralist theorists.
Yes. Yeah, so what was important there, you mentioned how they were grouped into certain traditions. So you immediately said, kind of the post-colonial theorists or the post-structuralists, and then also link them to particular fields like literature. Just in the chat box, I see Tanguy said Freud, Erikson, Maslow, Skinner, Asisipo mentioned Darwin. Yeah, these are all classical, very influential theorists, and also theorists influential beyond the particularities of their field. Somewhat like Darwin was evolution. I think it's like a word we use commonly, right? It's not only in the academic scholarly speak, it's also beyond that. And in many ways, theorists and theory building, when it's really effective, it manages to do exactly that. So it manages to offer us a view on the world that doesn't necessarily only have to be within the scholarly domain. It's so influential, it's so sharp, and offers us such new interpretations that we all just kind of later on speak in that way. Michaela has an interesting question. Could you see someone like J.S. Bach or Ludwig van Beethoven as theorists? They are musicians who brought a new way of thinking about music because of the music they composed. Michaela, I'll throw that question back to you. Why do you think you have to ask that question?
Because these are like people from they're not even from the humanities, they're from the art.
Yes. Yes. Well, exactly. That is another important question, is we tend to split these people into kind of sessions as well. The first thing that Jenny did, and as I commented, Jenny immediately literature, and then post-colonial, post-structural, feminist, etc. And we do that on so many levels of thinking. We split and we categorize and we hierarchize those concepts and those categories. And then at some point, people fall out of the bandwagon. At some point, you can say, oh, they're no longer scholars. They are now artists, or they're artisans, or they're businessmen, or they're politicians, which in many ways is just a semantics, because they also theorize as they go along about their own life. We all do that. We all see patterns and we try to build a conception of what makes sense to us. But in the academy, we've made these kinds of rigid structures. So yes, if we think differently, there are many more to list. Just some of the other names in the chat as well: Marx, Weber, Durkheim, Deleuze-Guattari, Eisenman, Zumthor, Lamarck, Chomsky. Yeah, all of these are influential people. Now, seeing theorizing just off of these names, can someone please say something interesting about these names? Just a pattern in these names that you might see.
They're all old.
They're all old, yes. Most of them are dead. They're old and they're mostly male, or they're all male. Jenny named a few women. She mentioned Butler. But with the exception, I think, of Butler, everyone else are men. And not only men, what they are particularly... Oh, Zoe Wickham. There we go, Jenny. Thank you. They're men, but they're also a type of male. What type of male are they? And they're
White. European.
White. Or European. Yes, I think that's more the emphasis. Is more that they're European. And
more than
all those.
Central Northern Europeans.
Yes. So they're not Eastern Europeans. That's all.
Yeah, there's no Italians there. There are no Greeks there.
Yeah. And it's interesting how even someone like Marx, for example, who's so influential in kind of Eastern Europe and generally the East and the South, I think of Marx, he himself was a German. And German, of course, very much Western European. So we see these patterns emerging about who the kinds of theorists are. Thanks, Fortunate, Bataille, Derrida, Adorno, a bunch of important figures. So we have this kind of pattern. Now, this brings me to why it's important for us to think about theory building, is because even though these people are mostly European and mostly men, that does not mean that their experience or what they read, if we go back to Joe, what you mentioned about reading for patterns, the patterns that theorists have read have never only been in the ambits of their own context. In other words, Marx did not only look at capitalizing or industrializing Germany. He also looked at England, and he looked at other parts of West. He looked at France, he looked at other parts of Europe, etc. Durkheim did the same. Derrida, infamous for traveling the whole world. Adorno is infamous also for similar thing. So we have theorists, thinkers have always looked beyond their own confines of their own context. And Africa has always also been an important reference point. Now, it's interesting. I can't remember who the writer was. Apologies for not remembering who, but there was a writer who's a thinker in the start of African studies about 60, 70 years ago who said, the interesting thing about Africa is that it's the only continent outside of Europe that was not discovered. And by that, the author meant, or the thinker meant, America was discovered, quote unquote, by Europeans. They went on ships and they didn't know if there was a continent, and they found the continent. Oh, they discovered it, right? And they discovered, quote unquote, Antarctica, and they discovered, quote unquote, South America, and they discovered, quote unquote, Australia. Right? But Africa was never discovered in that sense, because the first writers in the Western canon were from the Mediterranean, the Greeks, the Mesopotamians, the Phoenicians, and they were part of the, at least, North African world, right? But at the same time, as Africa was not, quote unquote, discovered, Africa was still fashioned, it was still imagined. And the image here is this dark continent, this black continent. Now, that does not mean, importantly, that Africa did not, my finger is not moving. This does not mean that Africa has not been important in thinking. Now, you might have seen, I've seen this image a number of times on Facebook. I think over the past year or so, for some reason, it keeps on popping up. And this is just a representation of other countries across the world in terms of space, right? To show you just how large our continent is. What I'm trying to show you with this is not to show you, how large the continent is and how other countries could theoretically fit into the continent, but more to point to you to something. And that is that even though Africa has been this dark, quote-unquote, black, quote-unquote, continent, Africa has always been important as a place of data, as a place from which particularly Northern and European thinkers in various realms and where various domains of thinking have drawn on data, on quote-unquote facts, information, that they then use to theorize. So yes, Africa, in the minds of international discourse, has been this place of failure or this place of nothingness, but that doesn't mean that thinkers haven't used Africa to their own ends. And that's important for us to realize. I think most of us perhaps here know that, even though you might not have formulated in such terms yet. But it's important to recognize that, because it means that we can turn the tables, because it has been done with us, we have been used for data. And so therefore, it's not a place of nothingness. It's a place of acute potential and energy and vibrancy in thinking. The trajectory up till this point has just been that it's been extracted. So other parts of the world has almost been fascinated. They've been made wealthy. Thinkers have been made wealthy, have been made important, have been quote-unquote important, based off of their reading of Africa. And oftentimes, African thinkers have even been complicit in that in many ways. No, not always, not everyone, but some have been. So it's becoming aware of these kinds of dynamics so that we can be the ones to offer the theory of our own experiences, of our own lives, of our own realities, of our own challenges, of our own histories. Because again, it has always been, Africa has never been absent from world history. It's never been absent from world intellectual thought. The movement of that thought has just been not from within, outside, but almost extractivist, almost like a helicopter scholar. You go in with a helicopter, you land, you take a few notes, you fly back to Europe and you write the Blitzy article. And in many ways, the type of workshop that we're doing here today tries to challenge that and hopefully flip that around and do away with that kind of extant power dynamic. Okay, now again, it's not... There we go. Okay, now this was all kind of just backdrop. Critical and speculative. Could I ask again, what do you associate with those two words? Critical on the one hand, speculative. You can comment just on one or both. Ideas, impressions of critical and or speculative. Any ideas?
I guess one could say that critical looks for gap or flaws or perspectives that aren't apparent. Whereas speculative, is something that looks for the opportunities, creates meaning, and maybe it has more holes and gaps in it, but it puts something forward that is new, as opposed to, critique of something that's existing.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, so many ways the two complement one each other again. Just in the chat, Joe, I see, when you said speculative like predictive, yes. In a certain sense, yes. it has to do with not necessarily something that is, more thinking about what could be. So thinking, forward thinking in that sense. Plumley, yes, critical, careful analysis, both well, be it analyzing, evaluation, arguments, yes. So critical, that's mostly what I think what most of us would assume, and most of us think about when we think about critical, we associate with.
Sorry, can I something about critical?
Yes.
I'm also wondering about the critical as in critical race studies or critical studies, where it's beyond just this idea of like analysis or evaluation, and it's about sort of the consideration of power and laws.
Yes. So all of that important, and in effect, this tradition, as you mentioned now, Jenny, with critical race, critical whiteness studies, critical theory, critical sociology, all of these things mostly go back to Karl Marx and his way of thinking, and quite specifically his idea. This was from a letter that he wrote. It's quite infamous, and Prof. Gitlab quote this statement, where Marx says, "I'm referring to ruthless criticism of all that exists. Ruthless both in the sense of not being afraid of the results it arrives at, and in the sense of being just as little afraid of conflict with the powers that be." And critical thinking, critical scholarship in many ways comes down to this in the sense of critical theory, in the sense of how Prof. Kiet, for example, uses the word critique. Yes, I just see in the comment, in literary criticism, reading the text beyond just the story, but the other worlds the text opens. Yes, that's also part of this kind of Marxist or Marxian approach to critique, that is beyond just what is given, but almost an emphasis on the speculative inherently, thinking, forward thinking of what can be possible in this quote unquote future world. But it's important, even though he uses the word criticism, today there's quite a distinction between that. Critique refers to a very specific academic, well thought, a number of you mentioned kind of careful analysis, structured, being well aware, versus criticism. So criticism is just simply something is bad or something is good. Both of those are actually criticism. It doesn't mean anything outside of someone giving their opinion. But critique has to be reasoned in that sense. It has to offer an analysis. It has to have some kind of logic to it, in which it follows, it flows, it goes from point A to point B to point C. And it doesn't just say something is bad. It tells you why it is bad, how it is bad, or how it is good, or why it is good. So critique is not criticism. And those two are very distinct ideas. And it's important to remember that distinction, because oftentimes people might just say, "Oh, I'm critiquing this." And at closer look, you realize, no, they're just criticizing. They're not necessarily critiquing. Now, this person, does anyone know who he is? I'd be very surprised, because I always know the name, but I don't know how he looks like. Does anyone know who this person is, perhaps? No. Don't worry. His name is also not that well known, but he was quite influential. This is Auguste Comte, or Comte. People are you right at Comte, but it's Comte pronounced. Does anyone know who that name is, or have heard of that name? Auguste Comte. So, our dominant way of thinking in social sciences, at least in some respects, is owed to a large respect to this man. So whereas Marx is the kind of critical, the father, quote unquote, of critical theory, Comte is the theory, the father of positivism. And positivism is essentially a form of empiricism, which says that everything can be observed. Everything is kind of out there. It can be reasoned out, and that reason can be linked to observances, to things that are out there. And that's kind of the opposite in a certain way of critical theory. Because critical theory has this link, speculative, it has this link with the idea of possibility, of thinking beyond the world as it is now, versus positivism, which says, if things are the way they are, our theory should explain how things are, what they are. And the two, the positivism and the anti-positivism, are two very kind of prominent distinctions and two fighting camps in social theory, but in social sciences and humanities. But what we do and what this workshop is about is very much the anti-positivism. Now, that's not to say, this is not a tirade or crusade against positivism. It's not to say that positivism is bad or it's not good and there's no value. That's not the aim of this workshop. It's just to point this out and to tell you what frame of mind or what frame of reference we are drawing upon in the chair in particular. Because, as you know, the name of the chair is the chair in critical studies in higher education. So we are very much part of this anti-positivist critical scholarly tradition, which does not only emphasize what is, but as Jenny mentioned earlier, challenging the powers that be, focusing on inequalities, saying that there could be a different world. So when we break down critique and we break down speculation, three things on each point. Critique is linked to results. It's not afraid of what the results of its critiques are. So it's also not afraid of critiquing any kind of dogma. Right? So, and that's also another very important thing for prop, is the idea of being very wary of dogmas, kind of fixed ideas, and that this is how it is. So critique is always very wary of that, and the moment that someone says, I have the answer, even if it is a quote-unquote progressive answer, critique should immediately be critical of that as well. Okay, so that's firstly. Secondly, critique is very aware of power. That also comes through from Marx's letter quite firmly. The idea of very aware of power, and power is of course linked to inequality. And thirdly, critique is also aware of its position as not being criticism. So it's motivated in its task. It's not simply something that falls from the sky. And then in relation to speculation, we can do the same kinds of dimensions: dogma, inequality, motivation. Speculation is not only focused on observation, it can look at the world, but it's also wary of seeing observation as a dogma. Right? So in other words, it's not seeing observation as the be-all and the end-all. There are other ways of thinking. And that links to reason, and acknowledging that there are different types of reasons, and reason itself leads to inequalities. And thirdly, that there is a link to intuition, to what you can feel. This is what, Joe, you mentioned prediction, right? Prediction as this element of intuition, right? You feel something. You feel this is going to happen. You feel this is where something is going. The speculation has this emphasis on intuition as well. Okay. Now we're actually getting to concept analysis, or conceptual analysis. Could I ask, have any of you done a workshop in, or have your supervisor or someone in a class spoken about concept analysis or conceptual analysis? Just a quick yes or no in the chat box, please. Okay, Tlangi, could you perhaps say what the reference is, what your reference is to concept analysis?
Sure, no problem. I did a conceptual analysis for my treatise and honors, and we kind of looked at indigenous games as a form of psychological testing. So we kind of just looked at the games in terms of like concepts, and we could learn from the games as a way to inform developmental milestones in children. So it wasn't, we didn't use any primary research. So it was like secondary research from other people's ideas and concepts. And we kind of just analyzed like that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And did you find that was useful for going forward? I mean, post that workshop, have you worked with those ideas again about concept analysis or not really?
No, not really.
Okay. Thanks, Lamini. Camilla, your reference to concept analysis in fine arts.
So in the fine arts, if you're, going to be composing something like a painting or a sculpture or even a photograph, you need to think about your concept. So you have to think about how you're going to compose particular elements, themes, ideas, what patterns you're going to use. And by patterns, I don't mean texture or color. So how are you going to make things fit together conceptually? Are you going to be referencing particular artwork?
Okay. Yes.
So so your conceptual analysis and critically looking at how you are making your creation.
Okay, interesting. So there's a link between kind of theory as this abstract category of thought with your practice as an artist. Is that kind of what you were doing?
Yeah.
Okay.
And it's meaning making.
Yes. Yeah. So between Tlangi and your experience, Michaela, I think we have the bulk of what concept analysis is about. You have these concepts and ideas, and concept analysis is in many ways about meaning making, or perhaps more meaning unpacking. So taking something that supposedly has meaning, a concept, and trying to find ways in which we can unpack it and make meaning from it. Now, we all kind of do concept analysis, even if it's only in a very rudimentary, in the form of a literature review. So when you do a literature review, in many ways, you are bringing together what has been written on a given topic, and you place it in a critical light. Now, of course, there are different types of literature reviews, and some people literally just summarize an idea. That's a very, very kind of rudimentary form of literature review. But the moment that you have some kind of critique on the existing literature, which will be on a certain concept, right, a certain idea, then you are in one way or the other busy with the literature, the conceptual analysis, even though it's very limited. But I want you to keep this in mind because, again, this is a touch point for you to think about the rest of what we discussed with your own work. So think about literature review as a possible entry point between this quote-unquote new thing of conceptual analysis and what you have been doing already. Now, just to say that a concept is in many ways a floating signifier, right? It's a word that means various things in various points. So if you think about concept in relation to theory, a concept can itself stand for a theory, or a concept can be a part of a theory, or a concept can be different parts of a concept. Different concepts make up other concepts. So the word concept in many ways is very much floating. I just want you to, when you look at this, what you see in front of you, there's two parts of it. There's something underneath it, and there's something kind of next to it, on top of it. The something underneath it, the syntagmatic elements, are other concepts. So every concept is defined by and made by other concepts. So it's never just onto itself, obviously, right? Because just by defining a word, you need a sentence to define a single word. So if you go to the dictionary. So concepts are always stand in relation to other concepts, And that's on the syntagmatic level, in the sense of what constitutes it. But the concept itself has its paradigmatic level. Paradigm, in other words, it has its own kind of relation to other ideas and other frames of reference that transcend it. And that's next to it, but also on top of it. And when you do kind of conceptual analysis, an important part of the conceptual analysis on a paradigmatic level is to think about its hermeneutics. Now, its hermeneutics just means its kind of its meaning, its interpretation. So the first thing you ask yourself if you want to do a conceptual analysis, if you have a concept in front of you, is just ask yourself, what does this mean? It's a very simple question, but oftentimes it doesn't have a very simple answer. Or at least if you start asking other questions alongside it, you see this question becomes quite difficult. But this is the first supposedly easiest, simplest question to ask yourself. You look at the concept and you ask, what does it mean? What is its hermeneutics? Secondary to that, on the syntagmatic level, you ask yourself, what is this concept's poetics? Poetics refers to its structures, its internal relation. So if you have a particular concept, how does its constituent concepts, its underlying ideas and reference points, how do those different ideas and different sub-concepts, how do they speak to each other to create this broader concept? So again, you have the hermeneutics. That's the first level, just what does this mean? And then on the secondary level, you ask yourself, how does this concept, how is it structured? How does it relate to other specific concepts? But there's also a third level of analysis. And very often, if you do a kind of literature review, very often, even if you don't think about it as such, you do this. You ask yourself, what is the field? What is the discipline? What is the approach? What is the methodology? What is the concept? You ask yourself this question, and in the line of your literature review, you also do that. You provide an answer to what this thing is. But you also speak about how its underlying structure, how it's made, how it's formulated in relation to other ideas. But there's a third dimension which very often people don't do, or they don't necessarily think about. And this third dimension is the distinction between, often people think about distinction, it's often the distinction between a distinction in a kind of master's dissertation and a not distinction, or a very good groundbreaking analysis versus just a very good kind of but nevertheless run-of-the-mill analysis. And that is to identify the weak points in the concept. So what it is, how is it, but also what is it not? And that what is it not is not to say, okay, kind of the antonym of the concept, not the opposite of the concept, but what is not being said in that concept. In other words, concepts always have blind spots. It's impossible for it not to. And when you do the conceptual analysis, the question, the onus is on you, kind of, or at least if you really want to make contribution to sculpture, the question is, can you identify, highlight, and engage with those blind spots of the particular concept? So again, if you think about this as a literature review, a standard literature review summarizes. And a standard literature review will summarize by virtue of saying, this is what is happening in the concept, this is how it looks like. Then you ask yourself, how is it constituted? What's all the concepts? How is this field constructed? But a very good literature review will then ask yourself, okay, now what's missing? What is unsaid? What has not been addressed? And how can I then possibly address that? fortunate. I just see your question. Would this part of the literature review be your points of divergence? Possibly, yes. It doesn't have to be. There are different ways of framing it. But yes, points of divergence can very much be that. You can illustrate, for example, in a literature review or conceptual, you can illustrate how people use a concept, but they use it in different ways, or they use it in one way in a similar way, but in another sense, different ways. And the result of that is kind of antithesis to each other. So yes, you can illustrate the tension in how a concept has been used or not used. That's part of a kind of conceptual analysis as well, is to bring those tensions to the fore that productively open a new avenue for discussion. You can say, look, person A said this and person B said this. They might think they're saying the same thing, but if we put them together, we can show that there's incongruence here, there's divergence here, and this can be productive. This can offer us a new way of thinking about why I was. Can I just ask at this point, does this kind of make sense? Is there, wow, that this thing keeps on jumping. Is there any other questions or comments at this point on what we've discussed up to this point? Okay, I think I'll take that then as a no. Hopefully it's clear. Just to show you quickly, and now we're all in, this thing doesn't turn, since we're all in CriSHET, FB, hopefully be known to you at some levels. But the work that what we're doing, for example, in CUS and critical university studies. Critical university studies, as most of you would know, is not the first way of studying the university. There are other ways, including higher education studies and higher education transformation studies. And part of the work that we've done, for example, in the past, was to discern what are these other fields? What are these other fields saying? How are they saying it? So that we in CUS can get to the point of saying, okay, what do we do differently? So in many ways, we were asking ourselves the question, what is the university? What does the concept of the university mean? And what are the constituent concepts of the university in, number one, higher education studies, and number two, higher education transformation studies? And then you can get to the point of saying, okay, what does the concept university mean? How do we want to define it within our domain of inquiry? So what you're seeing here is a summary of a kind of literature review, asking different specific types of questions. But underlying this kind of analysis is an awareness of the concept of the university and the different ways in which people view it. In higher education studies, for example, there was very little thinking of the university as a concept. In many ways, the university in higher education studies is just a space, right? It's a place, it's a building within which people go and study. Students and their staff. Higher education transformation studies, for example, saw it almost in the plural. It saw it as spaces. It saw it as something that is moving. There are many different stakeholders. It changes. It's dynamic. In critical university studies, on the other side, the emphasis is more on the idea. So in each of these different trajectories, different ways of inquiry, the concept university stands for something else, from a singular base, kind of very much place, to spaces, a bit plural, but still, still a building, but there are different stakeholders. The space can kind of spill over into other spaces. And thirdly, there's this emphasis on idea. And at each point you ask yourself, okay, what is the limitations of this new way of thinking about the concept of university? Again, okay. So when you do concept analysis, 3 questions. And the first 2, the easy ones in many ways. Third one is the more challenging. Firstly, you ask yourself, what is the intended meaning? Secondly, what are the constituent concepts? And thirdly, what is left unsaid? And by that is, by the unsaid, you can very often turn to these other questions. You can turn to these sets of questions in relation to dogma, to inequality, to motivation. So you can ask yourself, for example, how does this concept of the university does or does not link to a particular dogma? Or how does this concept of the university create a power relation of inequality? Does it or does it not? Does it feed new inequalities? Does it hold existing inequalities? So those kinds of questions are part of this third question of the unsaid. That's where the real criticality comes in, after you've discerned what the concepts mean, what the concept means, how the concept is constituted, how it's formulated, how it's constructed. After you've answered these easier questions, you then ask yourself these more critical questions. Now, breakout rooms. I'm going to ask Jenny to put us into breakout rooms, and there's going, and we're going to go into 3 groups, so we'll probably be about 4, 5 in a group. And the idea here is, from your own background, from your own research, from your own writings, it can be something you've done in the past, from if you're, for example, the masters and you haven't really thought so much about concepts, it can be something from your honors. If you are busy with your masters, it's a good chance to do it, or doctorate or postdoc or whatever. Think about your own research. Take a few minutes, 3, 4, 5 minutes, perhaps a bit less, but take what time you need. Identify a concept, a very prominent, important concept in your study or in your field, or even just broadly in your discipline. Write it down. Ask yourself, what is the meaning, the general kind of meaning of this word, of this concept? How is it generally used? What do people mean by it? Number 1. Number 2, you write down how is it constituted by other concepts. So how is it scaffolded? What does it need? What other concepts and ideas does it need to function in your field? And then thirdly, you ask yourself, from your perspective, from your reading of this concept, from what you've seen of it, what is unsaid about it or of it? What does it not say? How does that relate to, again, things like power inequalities, like dogma? How does its unsaidness, things that has not been said, how is that problematic in relation to the concept? So you're trying to see what is, right? What does it mean? How it's constituted? But thirdly, also, what do you think are its problems? So we're going to be in breakout groups. You take a few minutes, write it down, and then in your group, someone just starts speaking. And I want each one of us to have a chance to speak from our own kind of disciplinary backdrops. Does that kind of make sense?
I have a clarifying question. One.
Yeah.
So does each person in the breakout room come up with their own concept?
Yeah.
Or just choose a concept and then each write about it from their perspective?
No, I want you to come from your own background. So from your...
Okay, I'm sorry.
Each one brings their own concept. So it can be anything.
Okay, so the discussion is more on... The discussion is around each person's concept and what they came up with.
Yes. So and you can ask in your groups, each one speaks about their own question, but then you as a listener, I want you also to focus on what you identify perhaps as something that has not been said. So for example, from your disciplinary background, if you listen to another concept, someone else speaking about from another field, what are the things that you might hear what they're saying that for you might seem, okay, but this can also be a problem. Have you considered this problem? So that's the kind of bringing your disciplinary frame to bear on someone else. So you might be a sociologist, someone else is a literary scholar, and the person, literary scholar, speaks about the problems of the novel, for example, the concept of the novel. You say a novel is a book, it's a long narrative story, long narrative. The novel is constituent of the concept of book, narrative, narration, characters. Okay, those are the concepts. Now, what's often left unsaid about the novel is that it's something that you need a lot of money for. You need someone to read the book, someone needs to be able to purchase it. It's a long book, it takes a lot to publish it, etc. And someone from sociology might turn around and say, oh, but reading a novel is something that you read on your own. So how does the novel, for example, foster community when it's such an individual action? You just listen. You think it doesn't have to be as quick as I've now just done it right now, because I can think it out by myself. But the question is here to listen to what others in the group are saying about their concepts and try to constructively to think, okay, perhaps it's a concept that's known to you in your field and use it in a different way. Then that's an opportune moment, right? To say, okay, we use it in this way. On the other side would just be, okay, I hear what you're saying. I'm thinking from my disciplinary background, this might be something that could be a challenge. So and take some time, right? Jot a few things down on a piece of paper on your phone, and then in the group speak. And it's just informal, just to speak, to share, and then to have some discussion around that.
Do you think 12 minutes will be enough?
If we need, do you think we need a bit more?
Oh, we can just come back earlier. It's just if I close the breakout room, it probably closes automatically at 12 minutes. So everyone's
if we close down, we can just consolidate again and see who needs, and if there's someone who hasn't been able to speak, we can speak in the group.
Okay, so I'll make it 12 minutes.
Okay.
I think you'll have to, everyone, when I set this up, I think you'll have to probably have to click and accept to move to the breakout room. So please do that. Otherwise, you're just going to stay here staring at a blank screen. Let's see how this goes. If you're ready, if we're all ready to break, if no one has questions. Okay, let's try it. Okay, that was us all getting kicked back from the from our breakaway rooms. Is everyone back? It should be. Everyone?
Seems like everyone's back, yeah? Think so? Great.
I know Joe didn't get to speak in our room, so I feel like he should contribute soon.
Yes, I think, Joe, you must deliver a eulogy for the whole group.
I thought I was saved by the bell.
Could I just ask, or Joe, is there anyone else who couldn't get a chance to speak in their group who would like to share with us now? Just if you want, please raise your hand, put your name in the chat, and we can see it. Oh, Fortunate as well. Okay, so Joe and then Fortunate. Joe, please.
Okay, so my concept was institution, and in general terms, which refers to rules, laws, that that govern the way human beings relate, the way things run. And when it comes to higher education, to education generally, but I see it particularly with higher education and universities, there seems to be a common interchange with organization. The idea of organization and the idea of institutions tend to overlap. So that, for me, has been a bit of my critique around how that concept is used, because indeed, a university has an institutional component to it, But when people talk of it as an institution, then they're often not referring to that. They're often referring to operations, to different things other than the constituent elements that allow the thing to be, which essentially is part of what then institutions will. Yeah.
Good. Thanks, Jeff.
I would also say like institution is an interesting one because it kind of refers to a kind of organization, but it also has that implication of something being an institution. Like you can refer to a person as an institution. It's almost like them being around for so long and being so kind of like established. And so I think there are connotations around the word institution that have sort of a sense of permanency, and possibly is that like if something is an institution, it's almost like harder to challenge because it's almost like taken for granted because it's so entrenched. So yeah, those would be my thoughts on that.
Thanks, Jenny. Fortunate, would you like to speak about your concept?
Thanks, Luan. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
I'm so sorry. I'm currently visiting my mom, and the network here in the township is so crazy. So I've just been struggling with network already. Hence, I've been going in and out, in and out. So I did not even get a chance to speak when we were in the breakaway room. But the concept, when you, Luan, you were giving us this exercise, which I think is very interesting. And I thought about something I'm grappling with in my own PhD studies, and it's this concept of arguing or forming erotic aesthetics as opposed to pornography. And yeah, the meaning around it is obviously like erotic aesthetics as a way to like critique pornography, for obviously how it's very colonial in its making. And some anti-pornography feminists have argued that it's very abusive. It's basically when you're watching porn, it's like you are playing a part in watching people getting raped, especially women. And you get like different scholars arguing from like from critical race theories, like your Jennifer C. Nash, how she speaks about how Black women specifically, how they are treated in porn as opposed to white women, and also how Black men themselves are treated in porn, like how they get praised for their phallus, but really they are not seen as a human beyond just the genital that they carry. Hence, if you want pornography, like interracial pornography, you see how Black men are praised for their genital and anything else. Like there's no humanity beyond what they can offer. So like I think what has been my struggle, like to your third provocation, like what is it not said, is how even porn studies, the current school of thought around studying pleasure in an academic arena, it's how it struggles like to sort of like not give solutions, but like really say what is eroticism without necessarily referring to pornography. That it doesn't really like give way to say how can we like undo the injustice of pornography, of how we conceptualize pleasure, of how we can even challenge like the power dynamics in when we have sex, like when we try and like get away from this idea of harmful sexual behaviors. So that's like my own struggles as well in my own PhD studies, where like, yeah, you can really say all the problematic things about pornography, but like it's like this perpetual struggle. And you can even like use it in another analogy when you think about scholars even in Afro-pessimism, when they speak about how the Black social condition, we can say like racism is a problem, but we don't really have a solution to undo all the injustices of colonialism. And it's the same thing when you go into like eroticism, where it's like, yeah, you can point out all the problematic things about pornography, but it's very, very hard to really come up with how do we really form an erotic aesthetic that doesn't make sexual encounters harmful, but at the same time also speak to the difficulties of power dynamics in sex itself, and also how there can be this concept of eroticism of power and also the power of eroticism. So yeah, I'll stop there.
Thanks, Fortune. What you just say, your concept and your problematization of it, I think it quite nicely links with Joe's notion of the institution. So it seems as if Born Studies is an institution, and you struggling to find, you see this institution as struggling to find criticality within this institution of Born Studies, struggling to find ways of conceptualization within it. So I quite liked it. Thank you. Any other comments, colleagues, either for Fortunate or Joe, or in fact, if there's anyone who wants to share something about their experience of this, thinking about a concept critically, or what they heard of others, is there any feedback? Yes, no? Okay. Then, I'm just going to get my share screen open again. Okay, now we're in the second half, the final half. Concept creation, which to me at least is a bit more fun, because you can play around with things, and I'm going to give you an exercise that will be about playing around, at least in one sense. So, we're working with the same idea, right? We're still working with a concept. The difference now is just not we critiquing someone else's concept or an existing concept. We're trying to create something new. The rules still apply, or the basic scaffolding is still the same. That you have a concept which consists of different other constituent words, phrases, ideas, syntagmatic plane, and then there's the paradigmatic frame, with what it means. So you still have those two dimensions. Now there's two kind of approaches to concept creation. The first is conceptual engineering. And conceptual engineering is when you take something that already exists, a word, a phrase, a concept, and you build on what that phrase, word, concept, what it already is. So you engineer something, so it's much more kind of building around something that exists, right? And a very, very good example of this, I think perhaps one of the best examples that we have in philosophy, is Steve Biko's Black consciousness, or not just Black consciousness, the word black. Because of course, in his writing, in the time that he was writing in, the tension was, the frame of reference was white and non-white. And what Biko wanted to do, what he did, was to fill the word black with a positive definition. So not only black as being non-white, but black as being black unto itself. So what he did was he looked at what white means, he looked at how non-white was mobilized, he looked at how different other forms of racial categorization, of colored and Indian, etc., Chinese, how these different words were, concepts from racial identity were mobilized. And then he formulated black as a positive definition that is not just the emptiness of white, but that is its own constituent element. So this is taking a word, because obviously black, he didn't coin the word black, right? Black exists in all languages, most languages at least, and it existed in English. But what Biko did was take this word, see it in a particular context, and use that context to engineer the word to a certain meaning. So he created meaning around the word black that didn't exist before it, at least not in English. And that today, of course, we use, and we know commonly, not only in the context of academia, but most people would know what you mean when you say black consciousness, and then when you use black in that black consciousness tradition. So Biko gives us an example of conceptual engineering. So again, you take a word that already exists, and you kind of fill it with new content. You give it a new meaning based off of other constituent concepts, like example, in the case of black, white, and non-white. Another approach is what we can call a pure concept creation. That means when there is no word or anything that exists prior to you coining that word. So again, the word black existed. People gave it new content, engineered the concept. In this case, concept creation, if we think about Achille Mbembe, for example, one of our most prolific living African thinkers, a very well-known concept of his is about necropower. Now, the word necropower, for example, didn't exist right before he coined it. There was no equivalent to necropower. But of course, it's still formulated within a broader frame. So it's not as if necropower falls from the ether. It doesn't just come from nowhere. He kind of used the word biopower, that was Foucault's term, to describe a certain power relation and the control over bodies. So there was an extant theory of biopower. He then coined the term necropower, death power, the power to control life and death. But that was also itself linked to another concept of his, which is necropolitics, the politics of life and death. So he created these two new concepts. In this case, I'm focusing on one, which is necropower. But again, they were formulated in a broader tradition, broader knowledge frame. So even pure concept creation, like Mbembe, is not necessarily made within a vacuum. People don't just sit and just concepts fall into their head. If that happens, it usually becomes a poem, right? So in terms of academic concept creation, it's still within a particular concept, plays in relation to other words, phrases, languages, other thinkers to establish itself. So if you want to do pure concept creation or even conceptual engineering, there's two ways in which you can kind of do it. If you want to think about an approach of how to do it. The first is the metaphor, and the second is analogy. Does anyone want to, kind of just by virtue of seeing these two words, would like to share what they think would be the difference between the two? Just by virtue of knowing what the difference is between a metaphor and analogy. Any ideas?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Oh, so I'm interested to hear just by virtue of hearing metaphor and analogy, what do you associate with those two words? Number one. And number two, how do you think that links to concept creation, metaphor and analogy?
So I link these two words to literature and the art. And it's ways of making things relatable.
Yes.
To the human condition, quite specific.
Yes, exactly. So metaphor, analogy, obviously literary studies terms, metaphor, something that stands in the place of something else, right? So if you say, so let's go back to Joe and Fortune. If we were to say porn studies is an institution, that's obviously a metaphor, right? Because porn studies isn't literally an institution, but we use the imagery of an institution to make the two relate to each other. Analogy, of course, is similar to a metaphor, making a relationship between things. Saying something is analogous to something else is establishing some kind of relation. And there's usually some kind of element of following. Something follows something else, then it's analogous. Now, in terms of concept creation, a good example of a metaphor is the spoon theory. Has anyone ever heard of the spoon theory? I wouldn't expect you to, but...
Is this the one about ADHD?
No. I think it has been... I think it has been used in that context, but it doesn't come from that context. But just, can you say what you know from that?
I only came across this recently, but basically spoons we use to represent almost like units of energy that could be used for a task.
Yes.
Yeah. And instead of just having that the energy wasn't just like a certain amount that would be split between like the tasks.
Yeah.
How much energy the task was, like you have a unit like a spoon. And once you have used that spoon, even if it's on like tie your shoes, the spoon is gone.
Yes.
That's what I understand.
Yes, precisely. That now what you just mean, that is a very particular concept of usage of spoon theory, but spoon theory was formulated as broad in relation to kind of mental health and other forms of health, is to say that you only have, when you wake up in the morning, you have one spoonful of energy. And so you can't go the whole day thinking you can, with one gulp and you have energy at the end of the day. You can kind of use a bit, but it's finite. So spoon theory uses the metaphor of the spoon to create an image of energy, of health, of relating in a day, of how much you can do in a day, etc. So that's an example of a metaphor of concept creation. So someone used the spoon to create a theory, or it's not really a theory in the extreme sense, but to create a mental image, right, with which you can grasp and understand what energy is, how energy is spent, how it's used, what you've given, what you're not given, etc. So this is one way of creating a concept, is by taking something concrete like a spoon and using that to then make something abstract very concrete for you. The second way of analogy, there are various ways. What we just spoke of, in terms of Shilmembe, for example, the coining of the word necropower is analogous to the word biopower, right? Because you have biopower, something power. So he said, okay, there's a different type of power. So it's still something power, but it's not biopower. So now it's necropower. So that form of wordplay, as it were, creating new concepts via analogy. Another way of thinking in a similar analogy sense is through translation. So recently, in a paper that's still being peer-reviewed things, I thought about the idea of origins, and I wanted to think of a new way of thinking about origins, particularly about the fallacies or the problems of origins, how people particularly kind of idealize origins and turn it into a mythic point in time. And I said in Afrikaans, the word origin is oorsprong. But interestingly about the word oorsprong, when you break it down, Afrikaans, you have the word oor, which means ear, and sprong, which is jump. So then I could use that play of ear jump to say, sometimes people think something is correct and definite and true in fact, but actual fact is an ear jump for them. It's an oorsprong. So they've made a few jumps and they've jumped to certain conclusions, even though it's not necessarily fact. So that's another kind of analogous play in concept creation, which I think we in South Africa or in our continent can do quite well in terms of using our languages just to translate a concept and to see what kind of play do you find in your own language that might not be the case in English or French or German or another kind of massive major world scientific language. So again, on the one hand, metaphor uses existing ideas, it uses of existing things to jump off of and to create something fun, or analogy is in one way or the next using something existing, a word, a concept, but then creating new language around that. And so
I'll ask you a question at this point.
yes.
So I think as host, I don't have a hand, so I'm just being rude.
Yes.
Where would you see where you essentially take two existing concepts and make them speak to each other, which is essentially is a new concept? You know what I mean? So I think in own work with the erotic and the idea of the ordinary erotic.
Yes, that is concept creation as well. That will be part of analogy because you're, in essence, you're taking things that exist and you're putting them into a new relation to each other. But it's not concrete, so it's a metaphor, not a metaphor. But you're using existing things and you're putting them into a new spin on them. So yes, that's also concept creation. And that's obviously a very popular one because you can quite easily saturate, with very potent concepts like the ordinary, like eroticism, so very potent concepts, and you bring them together and you fuse them, as it were, to create something new. So that will be analogy as well, because in effect you're kind of building a new word, but out of existing words.
It's that like what you're talking about, breaking down a concept into constituent.
Yes. Yes.
It will always be that kind of thing of you like looking at constituent concepts constantly being created and then seeing in relation to each other what new concepts they
Yes. Yeah. And yes, and this is an excellent question at this point, Jenny, because this is where we're at now. And to say that concepts, any type of concept, whether it's conceptual engineering, concept creation, and whether it's conceptual engineering, kind of pure concept creation, preceding it is always some kind of conceptual analysis. So you have to know what the concept is that you have a problem with, number one. You also have to know what you want to critique, number one. Number two, you have to know what its constituent elements. And based on that, you can either just create a new concept by utilizing the existing constituent concepts in a new way. For example, someone else might have a word for some, I don't know, porno jouissance. So, for example, jouissance, pleasure, and porno, obviously what it means. So, porno jouissance, erotic pleasure. Now, you might say, oh, but that word is not good enough, or the way in which it has been conceived, I don't like it, I want my own word. But underpinning porno jouissance is the words pornography, the ordinary, and erotic. So I'm going to take two of those words, ordinary and erotic, put them together, and give us a new concept. So oftentimes, new concepts come out of the inability of existing concepts to do the job, but you know what its constituent elements are, and then you reframe. If that's another creative way to come up with new concepts, is to go to existing things and put them into new relations of each other. That makes sense. So when you think about concept creation, from where does the concept flow? The concept analysis can never really be that far out of your mind, right? And remember as well that once you put a concept out there, someone else will also come along and do the same thing to you. Okay? So, in other words, it's always good to preempt that as well. To ask, I've now created this new concept, but what are the possible limitations? Where does it possibly not help? What are the new possible power relations and power inequalities that's established through it, etc.? So you ask yourself again, you have to keep these three questions in mind of conceptual analysis: intended meaning, constituent concepts, left unsaid. You cannot do away with these questions, even if you're only concerned. Even if you just start a paper and from the first go, I give you this concept. Even if that's your approach, and you don't do any kind of conceptual analysis in your paper formally, you still have to keep these questions at the back of your mind, because these are questions that will guide good concept creation. And of course, the broader frame of critique and speculation, being aware of not saying this concept is the be-all and the end, right? Being aware of new possible inequalities that your concept can create, because it inevitably will lead to some form of inequality. It might be, you might see it as a positive inequality, right? You might see it as a positive discrimination, but nevertheless, you need to be aware of how concepts inevitably lead to different kinds of relations, different kinds of formation, how it becomes rigid, for example, and what you can do to counter that. So concept creation, which might be the end of it, is still very much grounded in all of these other dimensions, all of these other elements. Now, our final exercise, two parts. Just see there's it in chat. Yes, thanks, Jenny. Yeah, keep on taking dogmas. Yeah, unkeepable grounds, that's another important word as well, keyword as it were. Never assume that when you do concept creation, particularly when you use existing concepts and you put them together, never assume people know what those existing concepts that you're putting together means, right? Again, going back to your example, the ordinary and the erotic. The ordinary, for example, is an important one because there's many different interpretations of what the ordinary means in academic scholarly language. So if you say, I'm Ndebele and I mean specifically this, then, I am not this and I'm not that. So you have to be clear about what you're including and also what you're excluding from your definitions. Otherwise, the concept will become meaningless. It will just be a kind of free for all, anything for everyone, and then doesn't have any potency. So a concept needs to have enough specificity for it to be meaningful, but also have enough room for it still to be generative in going forward. Right? Because obviously you want a concept to have space that other people can come and say, oh, I like what you did with it. I'm going to continue building this theory around your concept. So it's about seeing it both as something that needs to be specific, but not so specific that no one else can come and change it, or work with it in a generative sense. Now, our final pickup. If you are on your phone, it's going to be a bit difficult. But if you're on your laptop, it's a bit easier. There's a website called Random Word Generator. And in your breakout rooms, if you go and you go to this website, Random Word Generator, you go to the number of words and you put in 3. You can change it on the website, you can change it. Now, you don't change anything else. You just change the number of words to 3. You get a random number of words. Okay. You pick one of those words and you turn it into a concept by using the other 2 as your constituent concept. So I want you to engineer a concept. And remember, now this random is really random. So there's nouns and there's verbs and there's adjectives and there's everything and anything under the sun, right? So you'll get a mix of different words. 3 words, 1 you choose and you make a concept. You turn that word into a concept by drawing on the other 2 words. And I don't care what word it is, it's your decision, you decide. And then you share it with in the small group. And then if we have time, there's about 20 minutes left. If we have time, then I want you to, or even if you just want to, if it's not everyone in the group, to create or think about a possible concept in your own study, in your own field that you might want to engineer or create from. You feel that there isn't a word for something. Even if you don't have the word yet, you say, I want something. I want to create a word. I want to create a concept that can encapsulate this feeling or this idea. There's this gap in my study. I don't have. I want to have a new word for the word institution. I want a new word to encapsulate eroticism in porn studies. I want a new word, and think about with those in your group, what is that word? So, firstly, a random exercise, which is just about fun in that sense, but also generative and thinking about using these random words and creating something with it. And secondly, your own concept, your own ideas. If you have one, great. If you don't have one and you think, I want to have a word, I want to fill this gap in the research. 2 exercises. One random word generator you can find on the internet, and the other with your own research. Does that kind of make sense? 2 exercises.
Yep.
Okay.
So I've created the rooms. They're not going to be the same as last time. Random.
Random.
Which is kind of what. So, and it's also going to be 12 minutes. That's fine.
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine.
You will get kicked back here when you're done, but please join your own rooms. Go.
Okay, colleagues, I think, are we all back? Seems like it. Most of us are back. Did anyone not get a chance to share their concepts, their words, their phrases, their ideas? No. Okay, seems like everyone got a chance. Could I ask you just your experience of this? Your experience of kind of you creating something, even if it's, it was just fun. In that sense, it wasn't highly academic, but just your experience of taking a word, trying to make it into something, and having these other concepts underpinning it. Any responses to that? How does this feel? What was was it a challenge? Was it fun? Was it not? What response to that?
It was quite in spooning.
In spooning.
Yes.
I love that.
New word here.
Yeah.
For me, it was quite exciting. Like, my brain just felt like it was picking up a whole lot of spoons. It was so energized. But at the same time, like, as I was grabbing spoons, like, it felt like I was throwing away spoons as well, because my brain was just jumping from one concept to the other and, like, trying to create something new. So, yeah. It's a
good way. I'm glad to hear that, Michaela. In spooning. That's lovely. Put that in the chat and you write a paper on it. And then you should put all of us as co-authors. The whole CriSHET and ETP can be co-authors. Comes from this workshop.
I think we can just, like, co-publish under the name Minions.
In spooning. Thanks, Michaela. Any other comments, experiences, reflections?
I'm just going to jump in. Thanks, Luan. This has been great. But I realize that there's something really generative about this, and it could be a really great exercise if you're feeling very stuck about things or not sure where to take things. And just to pull seemingly different words together and try and create something new out of that. I think it could be something that, might break some of those some of those hurdles when you just kind of need to get things going. It kind of offers an opportunity to re-energize.
Yeah.
So thanks.
No, I'm glad to hear that's good to hear. I think that's the power of creativity. I think if you do another kind of creative activity, it will probably have the same effect in general. But because here we're working specifically with concepts and you're still kind of the academic frame, it gets that flowing. But yeah, I think as well as there's a lot of power in small creative acts like this that seemingly means nothing, but just gets you thinking, just gets your juices flowing, as it were. So I'm glad to hear that. Any other last comments? Because we 2 minutes to go. If there isn't any comments, need some spooning for the rest of the day.
Well, I have a comment on which I'd like to close. If
yes.
If Luan, you're happy, and if everyone in the group,
yes, I'm happy.
Yeah, is happy. So I think basically that we just say, firstly, on behalf of everyone here, thank you so much, Luan, for this. I found it extremely interesting. For myself, it was clarifying, I suppose, things that I know I do already in some of my work, but that isn't necessarily ever, I've never thought about it explicitly in this way. So that's been really fascinating. And then also, just say that this actually turned out it's quite exciting, because the discussion around metaphor and analogy kind of linked back to one of the sessions in the DCUS workshop, where we ended up talking about metaphor, and Crane Sudin was talking about catachresis. So all these kind of literary and poetic tools that seem to be so linked to the potential for concept creation, or I don't know, the finding better concepts or way thinking. So that's actually, you can see the links coming through, which is really nice between the different discussions we've been having. So and to the team who came today, thank you so much for making the time. I hope you got something out of it. Feel free to pop us a message or an email just saying if you had any critique any critique of the session, or if there's anything particularly learned, or if there's something that came out in this discussion that you would be interested in exploring further, or anything like that. Yeah, other than that, I think we can close it here, and everyone can go and have a good afternoon. Bye everyone.
Thanks everyone for attending. I appreciate it. Go well.
Sure.
Thanks everyone.